Good afternoon. My name's Gerald Midgley from the Centre for Systems Studies at the University of Hull, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next plenary speaker, who's Dan McGonigle from Defra. So a little bit about his background. Dan did an applied ecology PhD, and after several years in NGOs and in government, he emigrated to Italy to join Biodiversity International, where he set up a program to use science to inform policies in developing countries. So he returned back to the UK in 2019, and he set up Defra's Systems Research Program. So now Dan is Head of Systems Innovation and Futures in Defra's Chief Scientist's Office, and for the past 3 years, he's been leading Defra's efforts to establish a central systems research function. And his team works across Defra's remit on topics, really a wide range of topics relating to the environment, climate, farming, food, marine and waste, particularly focusing on the interactions between policies and cross-cutting challenges. So thank you very much, and over to you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Joel, for the introduction, and thank you also for the invitation to come and speak to you all today. It feels like a real privilege, actually, and really nice to come out and be physically at a conference. It feels like the first time in quite a while that I've done that. I should start by explaining what the acronym of Defra for people who aren't familiar with it. It's the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, so we're a government ministry supporting ministers and making policy. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the experiences that we've had over the last 3 years in setting up our own systems research program. It's not going to be a technical presentation, but I want to use this as an opportunity to really talk about some of the context of using and applying systems thinking in government, some of the challenges that we face. And when I talk about systems thinking, I'm particularly thinking about the deliberative approaches that we can use in a structured way to bring people together, to develop a shared understanding of some of the complexities of the areas that we're working in, and to provide some structure to dealing with that complexity. And my talk is going to focus on three main things. Firstly, I want to talk about some of our big environmental challenges that we're facing, and particularly climate change and global biodiversity loss, which I think are two of the most pressing problems facing us as a society at the moment. And of all the global problems, I think these are going to be two that we're still going to be talking about in 50 years' time. They are knotty, difficult, complex, wicked problems to untangle. And to be fair, we haven't been doing very well in terms of dealing with these problems at a international scale. And a reductionist approach to environmental policy making hasn't really worked in many cases. So there's a fundamental need for systems thinking. The second thing I want to talk about is specifically what does systems thinking look like in government, and what are the particular applications for systems thinking. And thirdly, I'll go into some of the things that we're doing to try and build capacity, not just in Defra, but across Whitehall, actually, across the government. And the final thing I want to do is really use this talk as a call to arms to all of you in the operational research profession. There's a huge demand for systems thinking in government at the moment. We have a huge amount of senior level buy-in, a rapidly growing capability in government, but we've got a long way to go, to be fair. There are really high expectations for what systems thinking can deliver, and we face some political and practical limitations in the ways we can work. So there's never been a better time for you as an operational research community or a systems thinking community to engage government on these issues, and we've never needed you more, to be honest. But I want to start by taking you back to a rainy October day in 2004. And in 2004, Defra had recently been formed, actually, about 3 years previously. It was a merger between the Department for the Environment and the Ministry for Agriculture. And the idea being that actually a lot of the environmental outcomes that we care about are driven by farming, which occupies, in this country, about 70% of our land area. So the idea was to try and tackle our environmental problems by putting the problem and the solutions together into the same ministry. Now, at the time, I was working for Devon Wildlife Trust down in the southwest of the UK on an EU-funded project which focused on ways of involving stakeholders in managing river catchments. We were working on the River Dart, which is an absolutely beautiful river which stretches down from Dartmoor through the rolling hills of the South Hams into the English Channel in the Dart estuary. It's a beautiful place. And we were looking at problems around a whole range of environmental problems on the river. We were looking at why salmon populations were declining. We were looking at what we could do about the growing problem of invasive species. How could we reverse the loss of important habitat, such as blanket bogs and other wetland habitats? How can we protect the shell fisheries in the estuary from the runoff from the farming up higher in the catchment? And what can we do to maintain and protect the character of the landscape that drew people to the area? And during this time, my colleagues and I traveled around the catchment, talking to many people about the river, about the problems it faced, and how best to safeguard it. And we spoke to fishermen, farmers, wildlife groups, local authorities, residents, schools, kayakers, environmental regulators, you name it. We went out and spoke to them. And after a while, one thing became quite clear. No two of these groups had the same viewpoint of what the problem was, nor the solutions. And each group had access to different information that led them to different conclusions. And many organizations were working on the river, in the river catchment with the same landowners and farmers, but on quite different issues. There were a huge range of environmental initiatives, but very few of them seemed to be talking to each other. And so on this particular day, going back to 2004, I was driving down to visit a farmer to talk to him about his soil management plan, and the Defra had recently stipulated that all farmers had to produce one of these plans as a way of trying to reduce soil erosion and runoff. And I thought this is a great opportunity. If I go and offer to help farmers with their plans, it's a really good way to get into the front door and talk to them about some of the issues that we care about within the Wildlife Trust. And so I drove down this sort of progressively narrower set of tracks. The roads got narrower and narrower as I drove into the darkest part of South Devon, pretty much, until the wing mirrors in the car were dragging me through the hedge on both sides. And finally, I got to the farm, and the farmer introduced me and made me a cup of tea and sat me down at his kitchen table and said to me, "So what have you come to talk to me about?" And I said to him, "Oh, I've come to help you with your soil management plan." And he looks at me with this blank expression on his face, and I started shuffling a bit and sort of thought, well, I said to him, you know, the plan that Defra want you to produce if you want to be eligible for any of your subsidies. And the farmer started looking very worried, and he didn't say anything. He stood up, he walked across the room, and picked up a great big cardboard box and put it on the table in front of me, and it was filled with advisory booklets and paperwork from a dozen different organizations. There were brown envelopes with who knows what inside them. And he said to me, "I have no idea what's in here. I haven't got time to read any of it, but I don't want to throw any of it away in case I get inspected." So the poor chap, we emptied the cardboard box out and we started going through it, and we found all sorts of different things inside there. There was guidance from the Rural Payments Agency on how to put ear tags onto cows. There was stuff from the RSPB about protecting the searle bunting, which is a rare bird species which lives in just that part of England. There was stuff from the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group on managing hedges, and there was booklet after booklet from Defra on various different aspects of managing the environment. It's an overwhelming sort of mess of policies and programs all directed at this same person. But as we spoke, I realized that the farmer wasn't interested in any of these things, or at least he didn't share the same objectives. It wasn't that he wasn't concerned with the environment, he was. He deeply cared about the area that he lived in and the quality of the environment. But he was most concerned with saving his dairy business in the aftermath of a foot-and-mouth outbreak, which had happened a couple of years earlier, and at a time when milk prices were at an all-time low. So, I mean, the reason for there's a stack of papers. The reason for telling you this story is I sort of think this is a microcosm of a global problem. And if you look at many of the global environmental problems that we're dealing with, they all have some common properties. You've got misaligned goals whereby different people have different values. People's individual motivations don't necessarily align with the interests of wider society. You've got very different perspectives and cultural values which affect people's view of the same situation. Data and knowledge isn't evenly distributed, and people have deep knowledge about only part of the system that they work in and not the other parts. You've got this problem, which I think was quite acute in the Dart Valley where I was working, where some of the larger scale global problems are quite invisible actually at local scales. It's completely, in fact, one of the other things we did was take a busload of shell fishermen up from the estuary up higher into the catchment to meet up with a group of farmers, and that was quite an insightful process as well in terms of sharing perspectives and bringing together people who had very different goals. You've got a complex set of interrelationships within the system, many interacting factors. It's really hard to predict the behavior of the system. And you've got boundary problems. Interventions can cause new problems if you draw your boundaries too narrowly. We need coordination across the sectors. So all of this adds up to create these systems which are quite difficult to intervene in. And actually, when you scale this up, and when you look at climate change at a global scale, or you look at biodiversity loss at a climate scale, at a global scale, we're dealing with some really high stakes at the moment and some really urgent timelines. We need to act now if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change. But the problem is, to act now, we need transformational change across many sectors. And the problem with transformational change in complex systems is that these systems tend to behave like complex systems in that they display homeostatic properties. If you prod them, they tend to bounce back. And that's the problem we face as policymakers, is where to intervene. Well, I missed a slide here, but so there, in the case of land use, there are many different drivers affecting the system. There are many different individuals who we need to act, and there are a wide range of outcomes that we need to basically understand and to manage. And the outcomes all interact with each other. And understanding the outcomes requires an understanding of the biophysical system, the environmental system. This is a sort of domain of environmental science. But the other side, understanding the behavior of the many actors involved, is the domain of social sciences. And actually, I think sometimes we focus on this as a scientific challenge as opposed to thinking about it as a complex socioecological situation that we need to manage. So it strikes me that environmental problems can be broadly split into two categories. There are the ones which are relatively simple to sort out. And an example of that, I think, is CFC emissions relating to sort of ozone depletion. Now, that was a problem which was a global problem, but one which is in the hands of a relatively small number of people and could be solved fairly easily by a single intervention, in this case, a change in regulation. So there are simple problems where there's a straightforward relationship between cause and effect, and there are these more complex problems where actually we need mass behavior change, where there are multiple causes. And what I've got here is a graph showing the UK greenhouse gas emissions over the last 30 years. And what you'll see from here is that actually there's two stories on this graph. We've got some sectors where we've made quite a lot of progress, actually. We're doing pretty well on energy supply. And that's because we've got rid of coal power stations, basically, and we've built quite a lot of wind turbines and built some solar energy capacity as well. So we're doing really well in some sectors which are fairly straightforward to. I say fairly straightforward. I don't work for the Department for Business, Energy and Skills. I think they would probably argue with me that it's straightforward to sort out, but at least it's clear what needs to happen. On some other sectors, and agriculture is quite a good example, and the graph on the right shows our emissions from agriculture, and you can see that they've been relatively static over the last 30 years, with maybe a slight decline, which is mainly accounted for by a reduction in livestock numbers, partly driven actually by foot and mouth rather than anything that we've done from a policy perspective. And so here we're in a different situation. We need mass behavior change from lots of different people, and we need actually quite a complex set of individual interventions which need to come together and work systemically. And about 45% of the carbon savings that are set out in the government's climate change net zero strategy, which was published last year, fit into this latter category, this category of being complex and difficult to manage and requiring some sort of mass behavior change. So we're talking about, with net zero at least, we're talking about a challenge which affects almost every part of every single government department and every single sector of the economy. I started this talk talking about mentioning in passing the formation of Defra, actually, and the fact that was bringing together of two different ministries with which had conflicting objectives to try and solve a problem. It was clearly we can't do that with something like net zero. It would be every part of the economy under a single department. But we can to some extent create structures that help groups come together. But we also need to create a culture of working systemically. And we need to equip people with the skills and the capability to do that, and the language and the concepts to start examining these problems as systems problems. It's very, very common to hear people to say we need a systems approach. It's quite rare, actually, to hear people explain what they mean by that and exactly what a systems approach looks like. So I'm going to go on to talk about my own current program, the Defra Systems Research Program, which, as Gerald said, we set up in 2019. And the context for setting this up was really driven by Brexit. And if you look at our environmental policy and agricultural policy and fisheries policy, actually, in the UK, the vast majority of it comes from European directives at some level. About 70% of our environmental policy was European in origin, and pretty much all of our agricultural policy at the time. And we were at a situation in 2019 where we had rapid policy development going on in all sorts of different parts of the department. There was activity going on everywhere, and people were quite rightly worried about the unintended outcomes of these changes and the potential for unexpected interactions between policy areas that we were changing. So the systems research program was put together as a way of trying to solve that. And we were a fairly unique team, I would say, in terms of Defra, in that we were a team that was 50% made up of civil servants and 50% made up of academics who had been seconded in, mostly 2 or 3 days a week, to help us design the program. And it was a fantastic group of people. We had 15 of us in total, all coming from quite different backgrounds. We had social researchers, we had some landscape ecologists, we had someone with an oceanography background, an atmospheric chemist. We even had a doctor, actually, in the team. Everyone coming at systems from quite different disciplines, but also with a huge range of specialist knowledge in the various systems and the various problems that Defra deals with as an organization. And that was a fascinating process to go through, this sort of coming together of people with very different ideas. And it took us, I would say, quite a long time to really work together as a team in terms of coming to a common understanding and a common framing. And the biggest problem of all really was translating systems concepts into the sort of language that's used in policymaking. And so we worked on this. We set up a whole range of individual projects focused on different things. We worked on things like air quality and waste, and we looked at blue carbon in the marine environment, for example, and land use change, and a whole range of other things. And we kept coming back together as a group and reflecting on what we were doing and reflecting on the learning that we were gathering from this process. We put together a primer on systems approaches for colleagues in Defra. And this is available online if you're interested in taking a look at it. But effectively, what we tried to do is to boil it down into some fairly simple concepts that we could take people through in a kind of interactive but structured process or set of processes. And our approach was really looking at how we could structure conversations to look at the purpose, the interrelationships, the perspectives, and the boundaries of the systems that we were working in. And what we tried to do is to bring together teams from across the department, and sometimes from other departments as well, to look at the interdependencies between their areas. We also work quite a lot with external academic groups, so working very much at the science policy interface. And we work with external stakeholders to some extent as well, and using systems approaches to facilitate conversations with them. And there's a range of different things that we're trying to do with the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years. One thing is looking at how we can balance competing goals. And if you look at going back to the land use example that I started with, and the poor farmer bombarded with boxes of booklets and guidance and forms that he had to fill in. There are a huge number of outcomes that are affected by what goes on our farmland, and a huge number of outcomes that we need to balance as policymakers, and there are trade-offs between these different outcomes. If you do things to reduce nitrate pollution to water, you run the risk of making air quality problems worse or greenhouse gas emissions worse. So we need to take a more holistic framing in terms of the way that we look at some of these problems. The second thing is avoiding unintended consequences, and I'll give you an example here. I don't know how well you can read that, but this is an example that we worked on, which was looking at food waste policy. And we were looking at the curbside collection of food waste, and whether or not we could use that as a way of avoiding food going into landfill, or food waste going into landfill. And food waste into landfill is quite a bad idea because it rots down and it produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And we wanted to avoid doing that, so we looked at whether we could set up separate collection infrastructure for food waste. And then we thought about what we could do with the food waste, and the obvious thing to do with it is to put it into some sort of anaerobic digestion process, which is fantastic because it creates methane, but it does it in a controlled way, and you can pump that methane back into the natural gas grid, which at the moment, actually, with what's going on with gas prices and energy prices at the moment, is something which is entirely desirable to do. And the more infrastructure you make, it cycles back, and you can pull more food waste back into that system. So there's a potential synergy between waste policy and energy policy. But then we went through a series of processes of sort of trying to expand the boundaries of this and sort of say, well, what might this mean for agriculture? What might it mean for our food system? What might it mean for the wider environment? And actually the system starts to grow and become more complex. And I don't know if this pointer, no, but so the problem with creating infrastructure for anaerobic digestion is that actually it's actually cheaper really to grow a crop and stick it straight into the anaerobic digester than it is to go to the effort of collecting food waste from people's houses and distribute it. So you run the risk of creating an incentive for farmers to grow the crop that's usually chosen for this purpose is maize. Maize is a crop which is harvested late in the autumn, so the ground is wet when the harvesters go on, which leads to soil compaction, which leads to water runoff, which leads to water pollution, and it leads to flooding. Anaerobic digestion also produces a byproduct, the digestate, which is the sludgy material which is left over. And you've got to do something with that, and the natural thing to do with that is to put it onto farmland, but it creates huge quantities of ammonia which goes up into the air and causes problems for human health. And you've got feedback loops going out over into food supply as a result of the land that's taken out of production as well. So we're looking here at a process of taking our policy colleagues through this process of trying to expand the boundaries of the way that they think about some of these problems. Another application that we've been looking at for systems thinking is finding out where best to intervene within a complex system. This is a causal loop map that we put together on the drivers of land use change, and it looks like a plate of spaghetti. But I think the important point is that the process of putting this map together was actually quite useful and created quite a lot of learning in the process. So maybe forget the map itself. The interesting thing that we did with this really was to realize that there's quite a wide range of points in the system where you could intervene. And most of our interventions on the agricultural side focus on either regulation or incentive payments, so the agri-environment schemes, which are sort of at the top towards the right-hand side. There's a huge number of other places in this system that we could intervene that we don't at the moment. We could look at access to data. We could look at training and knowledge and skills. We could look at rules around land tenancy. We could look at energy policy, as I've just described in my previous slide. So going through this process to find out where policy can intervene. And the fourth application that we've been looking at is really how we can bring people with us in policy. And there are two reasons it's quite useful to involve external stakeholders in some of these sort of deliberative systems approaches. First is it's great for gathering data and evidence that we can then feed into our own analysis and treat it as an analytical process. But it's actually a process which shifts people's worldviews. So could we apply systems approaches and governance designed around systems approaches of some of our environmental problems, which actually help drive the change that we want to see within the system? So shifting people's worldviews and actually looking at systems as a policy delivery mechanism. The problem we have within government with this, though, is that it's not always easy for us to go out and talk to external stakeholders, because people, when they see a government official, they like to lobby us, and it doesn't create the most natural and environment or most balanced environment for an open discussion about people's viewpoints, and it makes people probably slightly harder in their position than they might be if it was a sort of an independently organized situation. So that's something we've got to balance. There's also a certain risk averseness within government about going off and talking to people. We don't want to set hairs running. We don't want to raise people's expectations that we're going to do something that we then can't persuade our ministers is a politically acceptable thing to do. So there's some challenges for us in using systems within this sort of framing, which we need to come up with. Another aspect which I'm quite interested in at the moment is sort of playing around with what we can do in this area really is thinking about Defra, as well as a policy organisation, we're a science funding organisation. We fund quite a lot of research, and our research budgets are going up at the moment, which is a good thing. We have a fundamental challenge, I think, in that policymakers tend to ask questions which are too big to be answerable. And quite often we're interacting with research which is asking questions which is too small, which are too narrow to be useful. And so how do we bridge this? How do we bridge this gap? And I think the answer is not about a sort of process of knowledge exchange whereby we bring together people from lots of disciplines to talk about how their work fits together. The solution has got to be about developing transdisciplinary approaches to actually undertaking research on some of these complex environmental problems, where knowledge exchange comes out as an emergent property of the process. And that's not just getting academics and government officials like me together in the same room designing research and undertaking it. It's about bringing in a wider range of stakeholders into that research process as well, and drawing on different types of knowledge about these systems. So I sort of summarizing all of that and bringing it together, I think there are three main applications for systems thinking in government. The first is framing policy discussions, so unpacking complex situations, managing conflicting policy goals, and identifying areas for policy intervention. The second is what I've just described, which is sort of working at the science-policy interface, which is about how do we structure the transdisciplinary research which really delivers for policy and really helps us make the decisions that we need to make in a timely way. But also about identifying and prioritizing research, identifying knowledge gaps and looking to fill them, and looking at ways of bringing together people in a participatory process to help contextualize and fill in the gaps in fragmented evidence and develop a coherent narrative out of that. And the third area is around, which I talked about as well, which is about supporting dialogue with stakeholders, understanding what matters to different people, considering multiple perspectives, and helping to deal with conflicts and negotiations, which are actually quite common within some of the situations that we're having to deal with. I talked about the shell fishermen versus the fishermen at the beginning of the talk as well, as a potential example of that. So in terms of the methods and approaches that we're applying, we're being a bit sort of flexible in mixing methods together. This is an example from the land use work, which is sort of I've drawn on throughout this presentation. But it's sort of indicative of the sort of thinking that we're putting into much of our systems work. It starts on the left of this diagram here, looking at bringing people together, drawing on different people's perspectives and knowledge through a process of deliberative workshops, sometimes interviews, to identify what the key variables are, where the system boundaries need to lie. And then a process of causal loop mapping, which is often, or developing some sort of other systems map, which is often also a participatory kind of group activity. And that's very much an iterative process we've found as well. On the land use work, we've then gone out and looked to map data onto the causal loop diagrams that we've produced, and map evidence on there as well, data on the variables. So where have we got historical data sets which help inform knowledge about how these variables have changed in the past, and where have we got research evidence which tells us about the relationships between the variables. And filling in the gaps there, sometimes with some expert elicitation. On the land use work, something we've been playing with is a bit of Bayesian modeling, some system dynamics modeling, basically, which then models different combinations of variables to try and work out which are the relationships and which are the variables which have the strongest influence on the outcomes that we're interested in. And then actually, so there's been a sort of transition from softer softer approaches into some more analytical approaches. And where we are now with the work is going back into soft systems workshops. So we're doing rich pictures with our policy colleagues across the department, and we're going through some of the processes and steps from soft systems methodology to help actually explore how we can transform these systems and try and broaden the thinking which is going into environmental policy. So I'm coming towards the end of my talk now. I just wanted to sort of step back and think slightly about how systems thinking really fits into Whitehall culture, or UK government culture, I should say. And we've got some things which work for us and some things which work against us. And I don't think this is a complete picture here. But on our side, we've got very high expectations for systems thinking. It's expected that we take systems approaches. We've got support from right at the top of our organisations, strong support from the Defra Permanent Secretary, the head of the department, strong support from our government chief scientists on this sort of way of working. On the career side, big picture thinking is actually something which civil servants are pretty good at, I think, as a whole. And I said earlier that we tend to ask questions which are unanswerable because they're too broad, which is probably true. But I think it is something which thinking about the wider implications of a piece of work is something which comes quite naturally, I think, to many civil servants. But our career paths don't necessarily create the right incentives for that to happen. And actually what happens in the UK civil service is that people tend to come in, work in a particular policy area for 2 or 3 years, and then move on to a different one. That's great in terms of getting a broad understanding of different parts of the economy if you've worked in defence, and then you go to education, and then you go to health. But actually, it doesn't really give you the incentive to think deeply and broadly about the problems within those areas. So how can we create some of the incentive structures and recognise the value in doing that sort of thinking? We've got a very strong evidence culture in the civil service, and I think it's fair to say that there's a stronger emphasis on sort of more traditional quantitative type sort of evidence than there is on qualitative evidence coming from some of these more deliberative processes. And actually, it's a journey that we went on as a team within Defra, which was, I think, coming in, and a lot of us were sort of locked into that way of thinking, that actually, the end goal for this will be to develop some maps that we can use and some hard models that we can then use to predict where we need to operate. I think the journey that we've been on is really learning actually the value and the power in some of these softer approaches, and particularly where we have to work rapidly. Our organisational structures, I put that as a red thing, which maybe works against us, and it's certainly true that our policy responsibilities are fairly split across both within our department, but across government as well, so that actually you've got different teams responsible for different outcomes, which doesn't quite allow for thinking about the interactions and interrelationships between these different outcomes. But on the other hand, we're quite good at creating new structures and new virtual structures when we need to deal with an emergency or a particular problem, and COVID-19 was a good example of that, I think. I mentioned the political constraints already. The other one which I wanted to just talk about quickly is time. And the other challenge that we have working in a policy environment, we're asking these massive questions. We want the answer by next Thursday, if possible, please, when the minister's got to go out and give a speech on whatever it is. So it's very difficult to get people to step out of whatever it is that's urgent on their desk on the day and get them to think ahead more strategically about where we need to be in 2 years' time or 3 years' time or 10 years' time. The one I skipped over there was skills, but that's because I wanted to sort of come back to it in my next slide, which is about sort of how we're building systems capability in government. Now, this is, as I say, we're on a journey, but we've got a number of communities of practice now. We've got our own Defra community of practice, which is growing very, very rapidly, and we invite speakers to come in and talk to us all the time. So if any of you would like to do that, please get in touch, and it'd be great to have some more voices coming in and speaking to us. We've got a cross-government community of practice as well, the Systems Thinking and Government Group, which is now 600 members from over 30 organizations. I think it's doubled in size in the last year or so. It's growing very rapidly, and there's a huge critical mass that's growing around systems thinking. We're developing training both through the Systems Thinking and Government Group and sort of locally within Defra as well. And we're developing a whole range of supporting materials, and I mentioned the primer on systems thinking that we developed for our colleagues within Defra. There's a whole suite of tools now available on the government website, gov.uk, which you can have a look at if you're interested in. Within Defra, I mentioned that we've sort of had this model of working with academic secondments as well. That's been, I think, a really powerful model, and it's one that we're keen to continue as well. And looking at that on a fairly flexible basis, maybe some shorter secondments and some longer secondments as well. And I mentioned on the slide here some interactive systems mapping that we've been developing. This is a tool that we've developed. It's the Net Zero Systems tool that we've developed in collaboration with BEIS, which is the Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And this is a way of potentially untangling the spaghetti on the diagram that I showed you previously and visualizing systems maps in a more interactive way. And I can't really show you on a static PowerPoint slide, but the tool enables you to drag the variables around, to double click on a variable, to look at first order, second order connections, to highlight particular causal loops that you might be interested in and that sort of thing. So it's something that we can give to our colleagues to play with, to try and get people to do their own learning about some of the things that they might want to incorporate in their own work. And I think these tools are useful, not necessarily for providing answers, but for helping people to ask the right questions. So a few reflections then to finish off with. For me, I mean, we've been on this learning journey in terms of getting into systems thinking as a department. It's been a process of continuous self-reflection, and I think each individual project that we get into is its own process of self-reflection. We're being pretty adaptive about the types of approaches that we take, and I think as we learn about new approaches, we're keen to try them out as well. One of the challenges is around getting through the politics, which I already mentioned. So, potentially we need to do more in terms of finding ways around some of the political barriers to engaging people in systems processes. So can we bring in expert witnesses, for example, to make sure we've included all relevant worldviews? If we can't bring in the relevant people for whatever reason themselves. Should we use independent facilitators, or should we outsource some of this work so that we've got a more neutral voice at the center of some of these conversations? I'm really excited about this sort of idea of mixing different methods and going from sort of soft to hard to soft again in terms of the types of approaches that we take, using participatory mapping to help build quantitative models, as I sort of just talked about briefly, but also using some of these harder models in a workshop setting to help people ask questions about the system and play around with scenarios, for example. And using systems maps to actually interrogate data. And we've got quite a big initiative, a big push within Defra at the moment to improve the accessibility of our environmental data sets more broadly. And then finally, I've put untangling the spaghetti there. So systems mapping, I think, has got two purposes to it, really. One is a sort of joint learning process to provide insights into how the system works. And there it's the it's the journey that's more important than the destination. It's the process which provides the learning. But actually, you get a map out of the back end of that as well. And sometimes those maps are pretty difficult to engage with. So the question there is, how can we improve the visualization of some of these systems? And how can we develop maps as communication tools? And that's a learning process that we're going through at the moment. So where I wanted to finish my talk was with my call to arms to you all. Net zero and our other environmental goals are fundamentally systemic problems. They can't be solved through technical fixes alone. We need whole system change. And we need to build skills and approaches within government to meet those challenges. We're getting there, I'd say. We're building that capacity, but there's still a huge way that we can go. And there's a massively growing demand for systems thinking and data science. So this is a call to all of you as an OR community to come and engage with us. Our door is open to new ideas and new approaches, and there's never been a better time to engage. So thank you very much to all of you for listening and for inviting me here today. I'm going to hand over, I think, back to Gerald now.
So we've got a few minutes for questions. Who would like to ask a question? At the top there. There's a microphone just down there.
Thank you very much. I spent a while at Defra trying to approach and, trying to think along a lot of those lines. And there's one problem I ran into so much that eventually I gave up and left. And I was wondering how you've dealt with this problem, which is that having spent the time, I often was able to get a lot of buy-in from policymakers to making these sort of designs. They love a map with little nodes on it all connected to each other. And you could say, oh, this is how this will affect this. You'd have a model, and then they'd say, okay, go ahead and try every possible set of inputs on these parameters and tell us what the global optimum solution is. And I'd say, well, hang on, how long do you think that's going to take? And they'd be like, well, there's like 10 of you, right? You've got a couple of weeks. And I'd be like, okay, with some basic assumptions, try longer than the universe has currently existed. And I could never get any buy-in for the idea that these systems, even if we represent them in a really quite simplified way, are going to be complicated enough that they cannot be exhaustively enumerated and optimally solved. Yeah. We will need kind of heuristic solutions, reduced local searches. We won't be able to come away confident we've always found the optimal solution, but we can do some things. And then I would lose buy-in from the policy side, who'd say, well, if it's not the right solution, we don't care. Like, we don't care about your guesses. You give us the right answer. And to be honest, the science side of the community wasn't that invested either. They would prefer to focus on their bit and argue that their bit should always be perfectly, exactly represented and solved, which if you try and then meet all of those requirements, you're back where you started. How do you get over that barrier? Because I never could.
It's lovely to hear you say that, because it's such a familiar story. It really is. And I mean, the fact of the matter, I find myself having the same kind of conversations, actually. My view is that these aren't systems that can be optimized. They are, how do you optimize between, if you're looking at the land use change example that I gave in my talk, you've got the Climate Change Committee on the one hand saying that we need to change the use of 25% of our farmland if we're going to meet net zero. On the biodiversity side, we're looking at having to put aside a third of our land for biodiversity gain. Well, that's adding up to quite a lot of land already, and at the end of the day, how do you optimize land use in a given place for what's actually not just biodiversity versus greenhouse gas reductions and carbon sequestration? It's air quality, it's flooding, it's whatever the local community wants to do. It's people going out and walking their dog and stuff like that, and having access to the countryside. And actually, the value is people's individual values which actually make sense of that. There is no optimum. The optimum is different for me than it would be for you. And actually, it's that process of taking people through the discussion, I think. And it's a, rather than a sort of decision support problem that we're looking at, it's a discussion support. You know, we're helping people to have those kind of discussions. And if anything, we're looking at satisficing rather than optimizing, as it were. So yeah, I think it's a conversation that's still going on.
Hi. So much in what you said. I'd love to engage with you afterwards. I'm old enough to have, and I've worked on sustainability for quite some time, and in various ways with Defra and in local government as well. And I'm curious because I'm remembering in everything you say, there was Local Agenda 2021, wasn't there, in the distant past, which is very much around stakeholder engagement, how you use facilitation to get multiple perspectives. And then more recently, the whole behavior change agenda, which probably wasn't that long ago, but, you know, 4Es models, mind space, toolkits, a whole culture change, you know, taking mind space around each department to try and help them understand a much more psychologically informed approach to policymaking. And so I'm curious, I'm kind of going, where's that gone? This feels like something of an evolution of that work. And is there learning from, because you're going like that already, is there learning from that? Because it's like, or is this an iteration of another potential, otherwise, kind of, this is going to do it this time. And I'm wondering about how we get the learning from these other iterations. And I know, because I worked a lot in Wales, my research was very much around that. There was very much a sense with the behavior change agenda that the issue was partly because the system itself, i.e. the civil service government, just didn't allow this to happen. It's almost something of what you said in the last question, because, and so we were trying to bring, and then with the behavioral insights team, they brought in behavioral government and said, actually, we need to turn the focus back on the system itself that is attempting to use a whole new approach. So I guess the question ultimately is, can you deliver a systems approach without applying, you know, a deep understanding and an application within the internal system? Because as it stands, you know, can that actually deliver on that?
I've got two answers to that question, I think. The sort of idealistic versus the pragmatic. And, you know, with my idealistic head, I'd say we fundamentally need a culture change in the way that we do government and that we operate as civil servants. But sort of pragmatically, I don't think that's going to happen. I think all we can hope for is to try and get some of the ideas percolating into sort of common everyday use. And I think you can't be a purist about this sort of thing. You're absolutely right. These ideas have been bubbling away for years and years. Sort of public dialogue and participation in things like river catchment management came in with the European Water Framework Directive back in 2005 or something like that, I think it was, or 2000, even earlier than that, I think. Then the behavioral insights work from the 2010, around that time. There's a lot of the same ideas, but with different names, and actually the names come in and out of fashion, but the ideas are what's important, and the concepts and the philosophy that underlies it. I think the thing that's changing now is actually the urgency and the scale of the problem that we're facing. And I think, I mean, we've just lost one Secretary of State and got a new one in, so we're maybe starting the conversation afresh there. But you know, the scale of the change that's required to meet net zero in land use is huge. It's frightening. It's a complete game changer, really, in terms of what's gone before. We've been talking, I think, about needing to have a strategy for land use in Defra for probably as long as I've been there. I joined in 2007 originally, and it's just been announced. So we're going to publish a framework on land use next year. It's never been politically acceptable up until now, but all of a sudden the politics have shifted because the scale of the problem, I think, is really catching up on us.
Thank you. I'm really sorry. I know other people want to ask questions, but I'll have to close it there. Please stay in your seats because we need to make a couple of announcements. But a last round of applause for Dan, please.